Thank you for joining us at the 10th anniversary edition of Expo Chicago, the International Exposition of Contemporary and Modern Art. I'm Kate Nesin, Director of Programming. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, presented in partnership by the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and arts professionals on the current issues that engage them. This afternoon's conversation celebrates Molly Zuckerman-Hartung's first museum monograph, Comic Relief. The book acts as both a record of the exhibition and the artist's wide-ranging body of work, from her involvement in the underground punk Riot Grrrl scene to her work as a painter and creator of layered multimedia objects. The monograph accompanied a major survey of Molly's work at the Blaffer Art Museum in Houston, curated by Tyler Blackwell, now a curator of contemporary art at the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, where he recently organized a major new reinstallation of the contemporary art collection. Tyler is also a participant in the 2023 Curatorial Forum, co-organized by Independent Curators International. And Molly's work, you can see in Corbett versus Dempsey's booth. This panel is presented in partnership with Printed Matter and Independent Curators International, and will be followed by a book signing of Comic Relief over in that corner over there. Make sure to stop by Printed Matter's booth this week, where you can find a selection from this year's Curatorial Forum participants, including Tyler. Please join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see all of you. Thank you for being here, and it's a pleasure to be back in Chicago. I spent a long time here, which is where I first encountered Molly's work, which we'll see an image of, like a photograph from 2010, which is not that long ago, but it is that long ago. And it is truly, we never got the chance during the run of the exhibition to speak about this book and your exhibition, so this is like quite the opportunity. Thank you to Expo for inviting us to do this. I'm just going to jump into it because we don't have that much time, and I'm going to be drinking a lot of water, so please forgive me. Oh yeah, here's the image from 2010. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. Yes, I know, and then I want you to talk about it because we don't want to hear me talk. We want to hear this big-brained person talk about her work. But just to give a little bit of a premise, the way that we're sort of thinking about this talk is thinking about the ways in which I was able to sort of become introduced to Molly's work, which sort of led to an exhibition being developed, and then which led to this monograph, which we're also talking about, in the sense that there's not been a major exhibition of Molly's work thus far. This was while I was at a museum in Houston, the Blaffer Art Museum, which I'll be talking a lot about, which is a non-collecting museum, which is also sort of like an experimental laboratory space, and therefore sort of the perfect venue for Molly's work to exist, and to sort of think about the ways in which we can or cannot bring order to your work, presenting it in a thematic exhibition. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the book and how that came to be. We're very grateful, too, to Printed Matter for working with us to make this possible. And Printed Matter also is helping us with supplying our wonderful copies, which are essentially sold out otherwise, which is very exciting. So just, again, I'm talking too much already. Just to begin a little bit, I was a student at the School of the Art Institute in 2010, and I had the chance. Molly was the co-founder of a space called Julius Caesar, and Kate, who just introduced us, is a current director of Julius Caesar. It's an alternative exhibition space, an artist-run space in the Garfield Park neighborhood. And it was as an undergraduate student, Julius Caesar, I don't know if you knew this, but Julius Caesar was like the very cool place to show your work, because it was run by all these artists who were sort of much smarter than you and were thinking about things that, as an undergraduate, sort of blew your mind. And so I had the chance. I visited whenever I could. Molly and I don't think we ever met at that point, but you were running the space with several other people.
Who I will name real quick because it's a requirement of that collaborative, always to name all the members every time Julius Caesar is invoked. It was Dana DiGiulio, Diego Leclerc, Hans-Peter Sundquist, Colby Schaft, and myself. Those were the founding members. And then now it exists as a sort of evolving venture is the wrong word, alternative space in which the directors sort of change over, and that's why I mentioned Kate. So she may have left already. But so this is at Julius Caesar, and Molly had a show that was called Scrying. And you can't quite tell, but in the image here on the left, there are a number of like paint can lids that have paint residue and perhaps performed paint gestures on top of them, then that are sitting on this sort of plinth in this small space with a number of like photographic collages, like in the sort of style of like a David Hockney, that evoked your studio space and any number other of spaces. And I want you to talk about this just in 1 second because it sort of creates a sort of foundational premise for the way in which I thought about your work, but also I think it plugs into how you think more broadly. But as a undergraduate student walking into this and sort of not realizing, thinking about how I could exist as an artist at the time, seeing a show like this was like totally bizarre. And I didn't understand it, and it took me a long time to understand it, to be honest. But that was the sort of introduction to Molly's work. I'd love to know what you now understand of it.
Will you tell us just a quick little bit about? I mean, taking us back 13 years.
Yeah, no, and it's not work I've thought about in a long time, but I can say a few brief things. The photo collages were all made of my studio in the style of David Hockney. And the idea was to kind of foreground the space of the studio as, looking back, clearly messy and like gridded, but also like sort of ungriddable, right? How do you sort of reconstruct the space image by image by image to kind of also give possible pockets of space within that space to kind of, I eventually started thinking I wanted to eventually connect it to myopic books, like get the collage to literally open up, and then myopic was somehow next to kind of use these images as a way to map both a real and an unreal space of the studio. Hello, you want to come in? The other side was the paint can lids, the jar lids, etc., and they were paint mixing tools for a long time that I collected. Clearly, that's just sort of residue of process, but I thought of them as these tiny little paintings. I made jokes at the time comparing them to iPhones or to like tea leaves, right? That's the idea of scrying as a kind of like forecasting or future telling. And the other part of it was that every one of those paint can lids paint lids was titled. And the list of titles was, in some ways, the best part of the show. They were all about violence and speed, because this was 2010 and we were feeling the internet kind of pick up the speed of life, of the art world, of making, of images. And so I was trying to sort of put pressure on the language of violence and speed. And so that's the titles.
So that's a lot. No. I mean, that's exactly what was fascinating and the thing that I could not grasp. And there's so many ideas in there that sort of became threads in which that sort of traveled throughout your practice in those years, which were like very productive years. I mean, you're productive in general, but like I think those years, which we had a lot of works from that period, were really included. These are also some images from Corbett versus Dempsey, Molly's gallery here in Chicago. These are also exhibitions that I saw in a sort of slightly more formal setting. Also, just like there are some traditional ways of hanging things, like in the bottom image and maybe the image on the right, but then there are these sort of structures and like multi-sided paintings that are happening in the top left image, which was your earliest show, I think, with Corbett. And
Negative Joy.
Negative Joy. And so broadly, I was interested in this idea of Molly being able to think about painting as like sort of a temperature taker, or painting as doing anything but just being a painting, in addition to just being a painting. And so there's a sort of this multiplicitous idea of what an object could be. Molly sort of treats her paintings with a reverence that is deeply steeped in history and ideas of what the medium is and could be and has been. But then also there is like a sort of freewheeling idea of like being able to disassemble everything that is precious. So that was what was intriguing to me about Molly's practice. I'm like trying to, so this is me, a lot of narrative for me, I'm sorry.
Led to Connecticut.
This led to Connecticut. This is Molly's home with her wife in Connecticut. This led to me wanting to mount an exhibition of Molly's work to think broadly.
It looks slightly better than that now, I just want to say. We're working on it all the time.
These are no. These are in Norfolk, Connecticut. These in sort of a relative, kind of remote place.
It's the foothills of the Berkshires.
The foothills of the Berkshires.
It's a town of 500.
And I was interested in this idea of being able to, I mean, obviously, as you may or may not sort of realize, or you yourself do this, I mean, sort of undertaking a survey project with an artist is a substantial thing. And so it felt important to me to sort of be able to visit Molly where things were happening. Of course, Molly's had many studios over the years, here in Chicago, many studios, but certainly in a variety of places as you sort of moved with your teaching opportunities. But this is like the sort of wonderful, bizarre, like funhouse that has its own history, which is very Molly. That
it was a Jewish commune for 40 years.
And so I wanted to visit her. And so whenever I visit, things have changed, I think, slightly, or maybe more than slightly, since I visited. But there were quite literally stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of drawings and paintings and everything in between and objects. And so these are images I took from visiting that I went back and looked for. And so it became about a dialogue, a collaboration in which we began to think about what things should live in the exhibition and then what things then maybe just by sheer amount of volume couldn't fit in the exhibition, but perhaps belonged in the book. So I parsed through this. Molly parsed through. I'm just showing you, these are some images. You can see the sort of stacks. You see some objects hanging that are like paintings, non-paintings. You see any number of wacky things that sort of, yep.
This process was like, I felt like I was just had to sleep the whole time.
Yeah, I
was like so exhausted by the idea that we were pulling things out of storage.
And so this was in 2017. So how did it feel like? I mean, because here comes this curator that had a loose. You're like, oh, he's maybe cognizant of him a little bit from Chicago, but not really. And he wants to do a show with me, and he wants to like go
historicize me. That's what you said. You said, I want to historicize you.
How did that feel?
I mean, my standard joke now about the show when I give a talk, and I've given a number that I talk about about the show in the talk, and I always say a mid-career retrospective is a midlife crisis. So basically, Tyler came along and said, I'd like to instigate your midlife crisis. Are you ready? Thank you.
No problem. Thank you. So this became like this adventure, as is often the case when you're mounting a survey of an artist's work, and Molly's work is not, so sort of. There are many ways in which to sort of engage like an artist as a curator in a museum context, and Molly's practice, looks like this. There are other artists who are like very cut and dry. They make X number of works a year. Everything is like very sort of neatly, wonderfully. This is wonderful in a different way. Neatly, wonderfully sort of considered, almost like a place for discovery and organization for future things to happen. Molly's sort of process, I think, which is so appealing to me, is sort of like an explosion constantly. And I don't know if you would describe yourself like that, but like this, how would you think about, or how did you think about this process of sort of burrowing into the past?
Since graduate school, actually, I have used the language of storage to talk about painting, that I thought painting was storage. And that also has to do with my own life history, which is that my parents ran a mini storage as a kid. So from age 8 to age 22 or something, I was in the mini storage all the time, cleaning and organizing. And so the very concept of storage has always been important to me. And I actually just have been reading about Franz Erhard Walter, the German artist, who also thought of art in terms of storage and then in terms of action. And I really like this. This is, I think, how I think about it. It's like things go into storage and then they come out and they can act. They can perform. They can do something. And then they go back into storage. And I think the acting is sort of the performative part of it. Yeah, so
it's like pulling things out of storage, in a matter of speaking, like
to bring them back
psychically
into possible action. Yeah.
And so I mentioned I was at this museum that you all may or may not be familiar with, a non-collecting space at the University of Houston that for years. We're going to talk about the publication a little bit and the sort of ways in which we entered into this. I mean, you hear Molly, she was just describe how she's currently reading or she recently read, and that's usually how Molly enters a conversation. Well, I was reading this, and this thing that she just read or the thing that she read 10 years ago is somehow applicable to this exact moment in time. And that is also one of those ways in which Molly is sort of this magical thinker and what I was drawn to. But in that sense, books obviously are radically important to Molly. And so this became a way in which this sort of project, this sort of storytelling, this new storytelling that could happen via an exhibition, via a monograph, could be a way in which get to put your own things into a book. And maybe that was like an appealing thing.
So appealing. Yeah, you asked me to find examples of books. That was like can I jump to that, or is that?
Sure. I was just going to say that, no. So we, just to get into the nuts and bolts, I mean, some of you may be here from the perspective of, from thinking about books, the Blaffer Art Museum does not have, many museums, as you may know, are lucky enough to have publishing arms or not, or they have people that work on their staff that are devoted specifically to making books about the exhibitions. The Blaffer is like a team of 8 people, sometimes less. And so I was very interested in this notion of trying to revive a publications program at the Blaffer, and Molly was sort of the perfect jumping off point because of this affinity for the printed thing. And so I engaged Inventory Press, and I'm just mentioning that because they were this totally wonderful partner in Los Angeles that has become a recurring partner. For the Blaffer and for a number of other small museums that are not able to publish things or distribute things. And so that they became our outlet. These are just some of the books. Like the Blaffer had this long history, some great things that they had printed in the past, early exhibitions of Amy Silman, Leonardo Drew, Tony Fair's retrospective, the Propeller Group with the MCA here in Chicago. just some quick examples, and then jump to this. So I asked Molly to think about what kind of books do you like? What do you want your book to look like?
That's like the best question ever. I was like, really? I just get to go and get pictures of like what makes a book feel wonderful? Yeah, so these are some of the books that I was excited about. There's more, right? There's another page. Yeah, and that one, the Blinky Palermo book, had this like wonderful orange linen cover that we ended up driving towards. There was also a lot of this kind of like, can I ramble a bit? Like, so Mark Owens, the designer, got all of these images, and then he was sort of, he understood them, and I didn't even really have a language for what I was just like, these feel right to me. And he was like, they're like textbooks. They feel like textbooks. They have this kind of language of textbooks or of like indexes and things, or sort of like classics of education. I really love those modern designs of like 1960s books, New Directions books. Like all of it was in this sort of the educational paradigm. So that's what Mark Owens picked up on. And then we had many, many discussions about how to make that happen.
Right, and so how do you begin to engage somebody who sort of has all of these sort of reference points, both from a just plain literary standpoint, but then also a design and sort of aesthetic point of view? And so that became an ongoing conversation, ways in which we can sort of think about, and that also helped me to think about the ways in which the sort of artworks that would get to be in the exhibition. So these things sort of happen simultaneously, which is not always the case, but as the publication started to take shape, here's some more. As the publication started to take shape, I was able to, with Molly, think about, okay, well, this really absolutely is an artwork that was formative, and the way in which, I mean, it has to be in the show. Whereas when you're coming out, when literally there are thousands of objects. So whenever there were moments of eureka like that, then it felt right. It felt correct. And this is leading to a point of view also about an aesthetic sort of that we brought to the book. I just wanted to briefly, these are the writers that we engaged. Kate Nesin, who you all may be familiar with, Lisa Darms, and Annie Bielski. Lisa, I mean, and this is, you wanted Lisa, I mean, you wanted all three of them to write, obviously, but yeah. Lisa was a person that you brought to the conversation, and I think that the thing that is sort of, that we've not talked about yet is that Molly was a member of, a participant in, I should say, Riot Grrrl, which is third wave feminism.
God, I always forget. It's the lipstick and queer phase.
That began in the early 90s.
Of feminism, yeah.
I like how I'm the one talking about this. And so there was an aesthetic sensibility, and just like sort of a way of living and working and making and being a part of community and having friends and community that were informing the ways in which you lived your life and the way you thought about the world. And, yeah.
Well, I think that maybe it was the most exciting thing about doing the show was the chance to finally contextualize myself in a way that stopped allowing me to seem eccentric. On some level, I'm just a product of a culture. There are a lot of other people like me. We made a world, this punk rock, Riot Grrrl culture. It wasn't just Olympia. It was all over the world. There were many, many, many young, weirdo, pierced, queer feminists like building this kind of movement. And it had aesthetics. It had, ideologies. There's another one, Sarah Pate. And so Lisa Darms was also a part of this. And I think like Lisa is now she ran the Fails for a long time at NYU, the archives, but now she's the executive director at Hauser and Wirth
of archives, yeah.
Of archives at Hauser and Wirth Institute. And she was also a Riot Grrrl and in Olympia and started the Riot Grrrl archives at the Fails. And she's a dear old friend of mine, also lives in Norfolk, where I managed to lure her there. So I wanted her to make a context so that I didn't seem so weird anymore.
And so this sort of point of view, I mean, which Molly participating in Riot Grrrl in her sort of formative years, I think, became this like thing that I latched onto as a sort of undercurrent in as a way of thinking through why and how you make things, and the sort of preciousness of a medium like painting. You weren't taught as an artist like formally until you arrived at the School of the Art Institute, but a bit later in life. And so that became a way in which Riot Grrrl, this notion, this aesthetic of sort of, these are some things on the right here from the period that you were a Riot Grrrl, and this is Molly participating with some wacky dolls and some great haircuts.
Puppets, absurdist theater puppets. That's Michel Foucault and Samuel Beckett, and I can't remember what the third one is.
Exactly. And so it's like that became this way in which the sort of taking on the status quo or taking on something that is mainstream or foundational to the way we live as a society is like dismantling that is sort of part of your DNA in my mind. Would you agree with that? Yeah. And so like and so that became a way in which I was able to sort of enter into Molly's practice and to start to make sense of it. There are these things that are where she is like so steeped and so well read in theory and the history of art and any number of things so therefore you have a reverence, a deep reverence for these things, but then you also are just like in your bones sort of programmed to take them apart, which is why Molly's work looks the way it does and why you make. And so this notion of Riot Grrrl became this aesthetic, this point of view became an aesthetic that we wanted to bring to the exhibition and bring to the book. And so there's just some programs on the right here, but again, you can sort of see the tie-ins with these pamphlets on the right of these like festivals that Molly was a part of / co-organized, and then the sort of aesthetic of those earlier books, and that we wanted to bring these are some Riot Grrrl period things. We wanted to bring this aesthetic into the book. And so it became an opportunity.
Cut and paste, Xerox, typewriters, very like specific DIY aesthetics. Before Home Depot talked about DIY, it was actually doing it yourself, and you had to go to the Kinko's. That's where and just steal as many copies as possible.
So, bringing all these things to bear. And then this is funny. This is like literally a photograph of a screenshot of there's still a note here, probably with, the little yellow thing is here, a note for the designer. It's missing the hyphen between self and portrait. But so this was an early pinhole self-portrait that Molly took of herself from 1995, sort of in the midst of your participation in Riot Grrrl. And so there is so much sort of, in my mind, like this is like, says a lot of things. And this is a very specific perspective of a lot of things. And again, this was the very first thing you saw when you entered the exhibition. But this began as a way in which we were able to sort of create it's very tiny, a little pinhole thing. But created a framework in which we were able to sort of make some sense out of like years worth of just production, perhaps. Maybe like a starting point, or like a beginning in which you sort of began to critically engage with the world. And so it was important to me to be able to tell that story in the exhibition and in the book. And so, again, since this is a printed matter program, I just thought I would show. We went through many iterations, sort of thinking about the ways in which those sorts of aesthetic cues that Molly found could lead to the thing that we have. And then we also, a big point of view too, is that a big point of view in the exhibition, and that ties perfectly into Riot Grrrl, is this notion of like a queered aesthetic, or like what does it mean to queer something? What does it mean to queer painting? which is what I argued that Molly does throughout her work. And so if you want to talk a little bit about the curves here and how that relates to this notion of queering, and then how that led to our curves. Curves.
The Q is curves. I don't know. I'm sure if I start talking about them, we'll veer into it. I started cutting curves because this is okay. I lived in a warehouse in Shelton, Connecticut, about a half an hour from Yale, where I was teaching, and it was a 2,000 square foot warehouse with no kitchen and no shower, just a kind of toilet stall. Eventually, my wife, Fox Hyson, moved from the Bay Area to live with me in Shelton. She put in a shower. We put in the shower, but she's the one that knows how to do that. And we had like a hot plate and whatever. And so living in this space, I started, Sam Messer, who was also teaching at Yale at the time, gave me the key to the shower in the sculpture building, in the basement of the sculpture building at Yale. And the reason that there was a key and the reason that he could give it to me is because they had locked the door and it was no longer accessible to students because they had started having orgies in the bathroom. So they couldn't let the students use it anymore. So it became my private shower. So I would take a shower in the basement, once a week or whatever, and then head upstairs to the Yale wood shop and cut curves out of scrap wood on the jigsaw? I always forget the name of the saw. Wow, I'm an artist. So because I had very little training. So I teach, and there are things that I teach really, really well, but the kind of formal training of here's how you use tools is not something I'm particularly good at. And when you're not good at something at a place like Yale, there's a lot of shame. Because it's a very performative, very people talk about imposter syndrome constantly there. It's really hard for students, teachers, everybody to sort of live up to something like that. So for me, it was really exciting. I started realizing just how much shame I had doing anything physical, material, public, because the shop is very public, and the shop person, Elizabeth Tubergen, or Erica Weissman, I knew them. They were cool. They were queer. I love these people. They would come over, though, because the saw was whining because of the way that I was cutting this curve. And they were worried about that sound. And so then I felt chastened and corrected, and I had to move. Just shame. So this whole thing, the more I thought about it, the more I cut these curves, the more I was like, this is amazing. This is this very simple lesson. It's this very simple shape, but there's so much you can do with the shape, right? It's a material thing that has a kind of direction to it, and years before that, I'm just going to go off for a second, had made a lot of drawings of penises because I was so interested in the way that every penis has its own direction. They go their own way, and so I had talked about how the penis is a clock, the cock is a clock, and so that men had a kind of external penis wearers had an external clock. That they could sort of be guided by, but that the menstrual clock, for example, was really different. And so I had this whole sort of language already for phallus, for structure, for movement, for pointing, for whatever all those gestures are that I was still very interested in. And I thought, I can bring this in again. It's formalism, but it's really fucked up queer formalism. It has a lot of shame involved, and it has a lot of sort of complications and turning of corners. The curve really allows you to turn a corner. It's like you move in a different direction. So then I brought the wooden cut shapes back into the sewing that I was doing, which then caused all the sewing to go bulgy and funky because suddenly the grids are really smooth and can stay flat, but curves do really amazing things to fit bodies, usually. So is that good?
That's great. So we wanted to bring the curve for all of its potential meanings, and also as a stand-in for a coded notion of queering or queerness, and queer here meaning, many things. Queer meaning maybe perhaps the dictionary definition, which can be same-sex, homosexual, whatever. Or it can mean to be alternative, or to think through something in a way that is different than the normal or different than the mainstream. And so Molly's work is, in my mind, was and is doing both of those things. And so the idea of sort of trying to make a symbol I mean, which is kind of what you've done. You've made a symbol of queerness being the curve.
Which is also just a smile or a frown.
Yeah, exactly.
Or a moon.
It's everything. It's an elemental shape, the curve. And so these are just some ideas. You know, these are like Molly's little sketches here, like thinking in ways in which, and of course, you know, our designer, the wonderful and talented Mark Owens, was like, what are you talking about, I think. And so we went back and forth many times, sort of thinking about, and this led to Molly sort of illustrating what she quite literally meant, ways in which that the curve, I mean, it's comical. The C's in comic, you know, like, it's sort of a joke. And so that is also part of the joke. I mean, this notion of humor runs throughout the work too. I mean, everything is like not so serious, but it's also steeped in so much seriousness. So it's all kind of a big joke.
I think we have to if we have time, we should explain something about humor or comedy.
Yeah. Just some more views. This is literally my iMac. This was my view of trying to think about all the different iterations. This is Molly playing around with the curves. Here's my little note here. We're thinking about drawing a table or making a table for Molly's exhibition.
20-foot long table.
And then this was the final product. And so we, you know.
But you can't see the pink, so it's pink.
It's hot pink.
Yeah.
And then the word relief, again, is sort of a joke. It is imprinted on the front. It is quite literally a relief. And so there's so many art historical things to bring to bear, which is how we engage the art historian Kate Nesin, who you saw her image earlier, to write about these ideas of relief in Molly's work. Because Molly's work, in my mind, sort of can sit between painting, object, floor, wall, and so many, many rich things here to think about. And so, again, this was sort of a gesture. Everything is sort of a gesture. Of thinking about ways in which we can communicate this idea of like the book is not taking itself too seriously. Relief is literally in relief. It has these curves, which are also, I mean, thank you for saying the word smile. I mean, these are smiles, these are frowns, these are like a twig. These are like things that can both be very serious or not. And so we landed on this book, and I don't know if there's a way in which I can. Oh, yep. So this is just. We were also sort of thinking about an elemental way of just like incorporating those Riot Grrrl aesthetics, in addition to including images of Molly's work in a way that was sort of a traditional monograph format. So how do all these things come to bear? And then, yeah.
Mark's idea about putting the kind of colored sections, which was just so beautiful. I think that's the big sort of textbook gesture.
Yeah, you can. I encourage you to take a peek at these books, but from the side, can you hold this up to the side?
Yeah,
they're like different. Each essay is sort of rendered in a different colored paper. So again, thinking about this notion of like the Xerox, or the thing that. So yeah, for the pink, for example, is Kate Nesin's essay. The blue.
Yours.
Is mine. And then there are images, too, where it's like, again, going back and forth from like this sort of staid monographic rendering of an artwork with its title underneath, and then these sort of moments of play or drawing. And they're next to each other. It's precious, but it's not. That's the next title for your next show. And these are some more images. This is an image from Lisa Darms where Lisa delved into sort of your association history with Riot Grrrl and how that really pulled and created an aesthetic point of view. With some that's a very early Molly painting, Touch Me, Feel Me. Things that are sort of, as you can imagine, touch points. And then some images from the Riot Grrrl period. That's an image of Angelique Hart. From 96 or 97. And then again, back to the sort of traditional image of the artwork. And then just to quickly, we have about a few more minutes just to talk about I'll just show images of the exhibition. And you can talk about, again, this notion of maybe laying out just a little bit, and then if anybody has any questions. But I'm just going to show this is, like, again, there were thousands of works.
I don't know about thousands.
There are thousands. there are thousands. Molly's like, no, there's not. There are thousands. And so this was like after about probably 20 rounds of winnowing down. The exhibition, the final exhibition had something like 120 plus objects in it, which for any museum exhibition is quite substantial. In a space like the Blaffer, which is teeny tiny, is extra substantial. And these are things that go from the monumental to the itty bitty. And so these are just some images of the way the exhibition was installed. And so, Molly, I wonder if you could just very briefly talk about what does it mean to like contain your life's work up to this point in this box, which is what we did here. I mean, we have this tapestry that you made that is sort of wrapped around the corner. The exhibition is inside of this box. And so we've like placed this as like a sort of gesture of care, perhaps. That's the way I was thinking of it. That wraps around the corner, but quite literally containing all these thoughts, all these ideas, all this heartache, drama, X, Y, and Z. What is it? I mean, like, what was it like to be with those objects again? To see some of them for the first time?
I think it was so, I do a lot of talks, and I spend a lot of time with the images of my work preparing talks. The work is mostly stored. It's mostly not stored in my house where Tyler has pictures of the attic. It's mostly stored in New York and in Chicago with galleries, or it belongs to people. It's in collections. Like, I don't see much of my work very often, and it's certainly not that old work. And I was struck by the surfaces, actually, just by the kind of I don't know, like in that painting in the entryway, going back, there's like salt incrustation the Chris Rock Oscars painting. There's salt incrustation, like just like the subtlety of the surface. There was just a lot of subtlety of surface that I had sort of forgotten all about, like just the touch in the work, and that it's actually so much about the touch. Because I think I do a lot of talking. Everything in image is not about touch, and but it has always been the touch and the materiality of the work that has really mattered to me in the making. But it's almost like I forget that because images are how we remember now. And so I think just being with the space, I was like constantly overwhelmed with just what was physically stored in them. I think more than anything, it's like there's like body residue in them, like physical, emotional memory in them. And I guess I was just struck by that, and how kind of somber a lot of them are. I think, the color is always turned up in image, and I don't know. I mean, I kind of thought it was like uglier and more beautiful than I ever expected it to be. And also very hard to digest, Like I mean the thing about the mid. I now feel like it's very digested. Like I think about gesture and the comedic on a physical, like slapstick level a lot. And I realized that's very much in the work in a way that was not always conscious.
Okay, just to end on this table, I'll just quickly go through the other images, but can you just briefly talk about this table? Because this was like, I walked through, was basically the path of walking through the exhibition, these images I just showed. And then the final gallery contained this massive, massive table that was wrapped in tinfoil. And I wonder, just like in 2 seconds, sorry.
No, I wanted a studio space that felt hard to look at. The tinfoil was the idea that it would sort of be blinding you while you were looking at these objects, both draw your attention and also kind of push you back out.
And in my mind too, it was almost, Molly's work is very self-referential and self-reflexive, and it's always sort of self-conscious in a way. And so by this gesture of like having a reflective material was sort of again another way in which it was a joke, but it was also an opportunity for like, well, these things are quite literally reflecting upon themselves. So that's the sort of beauty of Molly's work, and that these things sort of get to live 10 10 lives, all in themselves, just by virtue of the sort of ways in which she makes them. And this is our very last little joke, which was like the window paintings next to the windows. There's your curves. There's your phallus. Let's end on that. That was a lot.
That was beautiful. Well done.
So now we're going to, I think, open it up to some questions. If there are any questions, if there's not, that's totally fine. But I hope that there might be.
No, you must ask questions. Comments.
And we have some microphones handy.
I would love to hear you talk about the storage and how that informed the paintings, the storage that you grew up with.
Just talk more about storage, or? I mean it very physically, materially, because I did grow up around the storage and then also worked in used bookstores for a decade. So both are about a kind of repository. They're about physical material objects. So part of many of the early paintings had things like CDs or slides or Polaroids that had no images on them. So I was sort of, as I went to grad school in 2004, right? I applied with slides. By 2009, the internet had, completely obliterated the materiality that I had just begun to understand was vital. And I was like, oh, this is what it's all about for me. And then it was like, no more, right? We live in a digital world. And I think I designed my website based on this. It's the alphabet. I just felt like I want to be the thing that's dusty, that holds painting's history. I don't know. I want to be this sort of artist who somehow does this thing where painting as a discourse that's specific, that has a history, that can store that history physically, materially in its body. I'm going to do that. That's my job, because we're going to lose it, because we're not going to get it. It's not going to make any sense anymore as we move into an image horizon. So it was not storage in the sense of, in any kind of prosaic sense. It was in a kind of like, how do we hold on to a discourse? That is, just to be really clear, painting is very much to me about like mind and body flattening into that space, right? Like this kind of intellectual and material compression. It's so much about compression. Jack Whitten, apparently, at a talk he gave at Yale right before he died, used this word compression over and over when I tried to ask students, what did he say? What did he say? Like, I missed the talk, And the only word they could give me was compression, but I was like, hell yeah, that makes so much sense. So.
Yeah. Jill?
Hi. I really appreciated what you said about having that imposter syndrome at Yale, and that you weren't so, how shall I say, talented with the saw to cut the curve on the wood, but that you did, quote unquote, teach things really well. Uh-huh. And I'm wondering if you could...
It's recording me.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate about what it is that you teach well at Yale and how that is reflected in your practice.
Do I have any students in the room? Lauren, will you say something?
I think, one aspect of what is so interesting, and then I want you to answer that question, is that one of the writers that I showed was Annie Bielski, who is a former student of Molly's at SAIC. And Annie's essay, Annie's text was really allowing, like, it made space for Molly to be sort of an interlocutor, but also like a peer, and also a person that's going to like pull out the weirdness out of you. And so in my mind, just the notion of like, of an artist in their own right, being invited and thrilled. I mean, literally, I didn't even have to finish my sentence when I invited her to write for us because she was, yes, Molly, yes. And so I think that there is like this enthusiasm and this sort of rigor that Molly, which is what she did for me, working with her is sort of like this unburdening of your, you like get out of your own way in a way. And you're able to just like, again, there's something to do with like not taking things so seriously that allows for space to like for things to manifest in a way that maybe if it's a more formal relationship or a more formal sort of interpersonal connection, that those things would not be able to flourish. And that's, anyway, I just had to jump in. It's because it's very interesting for like an artist who is like Annie, is like relatively early in her career, is like blossoming into like a sort of major figure in her own right in recent months even. And so just it's very unique to like have that sort of rapport with students in which like it's also very hugely in my mind generous of Molly to say, yes, please write for my monograph, which will stand the test of time. So that's quite unique.
We're lucky.
If you're lucky, yeah.
I'm like, as soon as you ask me that, I start thinking about all the ways in which I fail as a teacher. Like, so there's, of course, teaching is a really huge part of my life, and it's something that I don't always feel that I do very well. But I do care about it a lot, and I think, try to push people, push myself, push boundaries, push into vulnerability, explore greater senses of self, I mean, students have very often told me that, especially undergrads, because they don't know how to maybe take themselves seriously yet, that I seem to see them and that I also take them seriously as artists. But I do think that that's not necessarily a serious thing, but that I'm expecting everybody I teach to become an artist, which of course is not what's happened. But I think that's really exciting for a young person to take that on. I'm always shoving ideas and books and thinking and history at people.
It's also just nice to find a teacher that is a endless sort of wealth of knowledge and rapport. You can write something to Molly and then she'll, in 24 hours, she'll have 10 ideas for you to think about these other things or the ways in which something may tie into one word that you said. And so there is that sort of endless place of Molly's the most well-read person that I've ever met, and I think that
I have nothing on Lisa Darms or anybody I know.
Well, yikes. And so, like, I think that is just that sort of becomes for as a former young art student, that is something that you latch onto. It's like a permission to think sideways or to think in a way that is not prescribed. And that is so for a mind that is looking for cues in which ways that they can be themselves, like that is hugely transformative.
That's beautiful. Thanks for saying that. No, it's true. I think that like the thinking that artists do, like you're supposed to misunderstand everything, you're supposed to get it wrong so that you can sort of chart your own path. And I'm committed to getting it wrong and to being like, that's great. Let's get wronger. Maybe that is...
It's another show title. Let's get wronger. One last question. Anybody? Snore. That's on the record now.
I find it funny to be watching this at an art fair because I'm wondering what you feel like when you sell something, that you're storing things, you're bringing them out, you're making them play with each other, putting them away, and when they go, how do you feel about it?
I mean, they've been going for a long time, I think, like I said, like getting to see certain things that had gone long ago was really exciting with the exhibition. But yeah, I'm really used to them going. I mean, it's funny because I do think like things are stored in there that are personal, that don't have anything to do with whatever the collector is going to do with the work, right? There's sort of different kinds of storage happening in them that is humorous to imagine them going into people's houses. But I long ago got very used to that that's one of the things that can happen with a painting. Something else that can happen is that it will be destroyed in my own home and film studio. But I don't feel, I guess what I'm saying is I don't feel particularly sentimental about them. It's not that relationship of storage.
Is part of your question also like this notion of the backdrop of like having a serious conversation about something? I mean, Molly is a very serious, unserious thinker, artist, right? So just the premise of like
Of the fair and sales and the market?
Yeah.
Right. I mean...
I'm reading into your question.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I think your question is interesting. I think I understand what you're saying, but no, it's interesting. I think there's a kind of precarity yeah, go ahead. I cannot make more. No, I mean, whatever there is it's like I'm constantly like, damn, that was a good one. Like when they're good, I cannot repeat it. People told me this when I was in school, like, Molly, you're like lightning, and then nothing. So it's not about, like, I can do it again, but I guess it is about, like, there it is, you move on, like, I don't know. Yeah. Not precious.
Not precious. Let's end there. Thank you, everybody.